Bang, why does it even matter if America's status as the global superpower is waning? Like, what's the risk here?
Well, the first step would be to make the point that almost everything we think is normal in the world is not normal. The stability and the prosperity that has dominated in the world for most of the post-war era, post-World War II era, is unusual, historically unusual. So the risk is that without a dominant hegemon that has both the power and the will to enforce stability and the systems that create that stability, you end up with an unstable world. Now, you might say, but we already have an unstable world, which is true, but the stability had always been contained. So, for example, and Trump is not the first American president to start wrecking the system that America itself created. American strategic credibility started to slide under Barack Obama. That was when he told the Syrian president not to use chemical weapons against his people, and if he did, he'd come after him. Obama did nothing. All the other dictators in the world took note, and that's why shortly thereafter, Vladimir Putin invaded for the first time Crimea and other parts of Ukraine, and then that's escalated because they could see the US had lost its will and its ability to do anything about it. Now that's accelerated, and you've seen the full-scale war now that Putin is waging against Ukraine and threatens to wage against all of Europe. So without a dominant and able and willing American hegemon, that sort of thing you could expect to break out more often, more widely across the world.
That sounds bad, Peter.
It is bad. I hate to break it to you, Samantha, but it's also the systems of prosperity. So here's a great example. The World Trade Organization was set up by the US after World War II to create a uniform system of rules. Communist countries were shut out during the Cold War. When 2000 hit, Bill Clinton said, look, that Cold War stuff's nonsense. I like China. Let's bring the Chinese into the system. And they did. The Americans, together with the other members of the WTO, admitted China. That was the takeoff point for the Chinese economy. Access to essentially free trade throughout that system. By admitting China allowed China to trade its way. The Chinese did the hard work, but it got access to a system it had been shut out of, and that turbocharged the Chinese economy. So there's another example of a system that only the US was able to create and maintain, and now Trump, of course, is vandalizing it.
Okay, well, let's turn to recent events then, which, as you've written, show that Donald Trump is vandalizing this, that America's superpower status is on the wane, because a main part of it is based in economics. So explain this to us.
Well, the essence of it is that, quite apart from the trade madness and erraticism, which has unnerved markets and governments all around the world, we now come up to a different problem, which is that the Americans are borrowing so much money to finance their government deficits that world markets have come to the point where they're wondering if that debt will ever be repaid. And that's a big problem. It's a big problem not just for the Americans, of course, that if they're forced into a default, that would be nothing new in the world because dozens of countries have. But if you are the center of the global financial system and you default, then we all have a problem. The US Treasury bond is the risk-free asset that the whole global financial system depends on and trades on. If that's under assault, then you have a global market chaos with unpredictable outcomes, but probably none of them very good. And that's the point we're approaching right now with the combination of reckless borrowing by successive presidents, now fomented and accelerated by Trump if he gets his new bill through the US Senate, as he's hoping to do.
Okay, well, we're going to get into his so-called big, beautiful bill. I mean, only Trump could call it that, right? But anyway, we'll get into that in just
Especially one that's so ugly.
Yeah, that's right. But first, I wanted you to walk us through two newborn acronyms that you've just written about that sort of tell the story, I guess, of what's happening in America with regards to the economy. So can you break it down for us? They sound funny, but they're not.
So these were born, these acronyms, just in the last month. The first one is, it's called the TACO trade, and that is, TACO, an acronym is for Trump Always Chickens Out, in reference to not just tariffs, but also his confrontations with other countries, threats, bluster. He's got no credibility anymore, and this TACO captures it. The second one relates to where investors want to put their money in the world when they look at all their options in global markets. And this is ABUSA, A-B-U-S-A, which stands for Anywhere But USA.
You've written that Trump is also on the cusp of surrendering a really unique source of U.S. power, perhaps the single most, and that's America's full faith in credit. That is the ability to borrow cheaply, to spend lavishly, and to enjoy the exorbitant privilege of issuing the global reserve currency. Now, for those of us like myself who don't really know what the global reserve currency means, like, what is the significance of America losing that status as the default global reserve currency?
Yeah, well, it's been really vital to the Americans because they can do any transaction they want in their own currency. So at the moment, they've got a huge deficit, 7-8% of GDP, which is just wildly out of kilter for its annual budget, and that's under threat of going up even further. And they can finance that readily because they can do it in their own currency. You don't have the risk that they won't be able to raise the funds, that their currency will collapse and they can't attract enough foreign investment to bulk it up. It's all done in their own currency.
Okay.
So it reduces a lot of the risk to them, but it also gives them the benefit that the whole world is transacting in their currency. So if you're an American company or traveller or whatever you are, it makes everything smooth, easy and convenient. You don't have to worry about exchange rates or anything else. It's all in US dollars. And this has had some benefits for other countries too. The entire commodities trade in the world, all of our iron ore and coal exports and all the rest of it goes in US dollars. It lubricates the whole system. So if that's gone, the world will suffer but can adjust.
Okay.
America would be the big victim.
But why? What would happen to America if the default currency was no longer the American dollar?
They would have trouble funding their deficit. In fact, it would probably provoke, if they can't finance their existing levels of consumption, it would provoke, at the very least, a recession, but quite possibly a more disorderly and deeper economic disruption to that whole country. And the risk is that that would suck much of the world's economic and financial activity down with it. So it could be, the really, if we take a step back from all of this, Samantha, the really big significance of what we're talking about here is we are witnessing in the daily news the implosion of an empire. We are witnessing the end of the American empire that has stood like a colossus across the globe since World War II. It's coming to an end. Donald Trump is accelerating it, and day by day, these developments we're talking about are all details in that larger pattern of decline. Like Mark Twain's death, it's often been the death of the American empire has been exaggerated.
Yes.
It's often been pronounced in the last 30 years, and it's never come about. But it's pretty hard to find anybody who will argue that now.
You did mention the bill that might pass through Senate. It hasn't yet. So tell us about Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill and why, if it does get passed by the Senate, this would be a case of fiscal vandalism that is either contributing to what we're talking about or maybe even worsens it. I don't know. You tell me.
No, it does. It would worsen it. So the domestic politics of it are ugly enough, this big, ugly bill. And that is that the poorest, would have about $1 trillion cut from their government entitlements over the next 10 years. They are principally food stamps. Food stamps are for people who can't afford to buy food, obviously. And the other is Medicaid, which is a program of free health insurance to the poorest, about 85 million Americans. And about 9 million of those would lose their eligibility under this bill. And now, combined, all of the cuts to these very basic assistance programs to the poorest of the poor would save the budget $1 trillion. And then Trump is saying, and the House of Reps that's put this bill together has said, but we want to spend $3 trillion on stuff for things that we actually care about. So don't worry about the poor, don't worry about our fellow citizens. We want to spend this money principally on extending the tax cuts that Trump put in place in 2017 because they're about to expire. And they are for people with high incomes and corporations. So that's pretty ugly, that redistribution away from the poor and in favour of the rich. And it might come as a surprise to some of the people who voted for Trump, the MAGA crowd who thought he was going to look after the little guy.
So it's like an anti-Robin Hood scenario.
It's the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It's the Sheriff of Nottingham.
Yeah, it's the Sheriff of Nottingham, okay?
And
great.
And that's their country, their problem. It's bad, but your problem. Where it affects the rest of us is that it would add somewhere between 3 and 4 trillion, depending on the shape of the final bill, dollars to the federal debt over the next 10 years. And investors have started saying, well, we think you've already got too much debt, 122% of GDP, and you're going to do all this. And look at all these crazy erratic policies you're announcing all the time.
Yeah.
The American dollar, and there's been a sell-off of the US dollar and US bonds going on at a fair clip ever since so-called Liberation Day, April 2.
Okay, what does that mean, a sell-off of US bonds?
It means that investors, and it happens, you get bonds bought heavily one day and sold heavily the next. The unusual factor is that you're getting bonds sold off and the US dollar sold off at the same time. This is a walking away from America as an investment prospect, hence abuser anywhere but USA. That is unusual and usually presages a crisis.
So tell us what historian Niall Ferguson has said about this, because he has sort of rung the bell of alarm, I guess.
Yeah. He published a paper in February proposing what he calls Ferguson's Law. And Ferguson's Law states that if you look back through history, an empire begins to decline when it is spending more money servicing its debts than it is spending on its military. And that last year, 2024, the US crossed that line for the first time in a century, almost a century. So according to his logic, and he goes back to the Habsburg Empire through to the British Empire, he traces this pattern. An empire can cross that line and recover, but if it stays beyond that line, spending more just paying for its debts than it does for its military, his thesis is that an empire is finished.
I believe he also said that, just furthering on what you just said, so it essentially leaves the power increasingly vulnerable to military challenge. So
yes, and to internal fragility as well.
So essentially what we could see is America become a target for enemies, really, for the first time in a very long time? Like, is that the sort of pointy end of what we're discussing?
Yes, and you see it already in cyber attack. You see it in the sort of grey zone warfare of cyber attack, but also the cutting of undersea cables that connect the internet around the world, and 95% of communications around the world. Chinese and Russian proxies are doing this week in and week out. You see it in the attempts to not only conquer Ukraine, but to dismember NATO, which is a US-led, US-based alliance. And you see it in the Pacific, where our Chinese friends are busy trying to are actually successfully claiming maritime territories from the Philippines, which is a US treaty ally, while the US does nothing. So you would see that move from the fringes increasingly to the centre, because the US still has a very powerful military. It just doesn't seem any longer to have the willpower or the judgment to use it well or wisely.
Are we seeing this play out in just what happened yesterday when Donald Trump threatened Russian President Vladimir Putin over social media, writing that Putin was playing with fire by refusing to engage in ceasefire talks with Kyiv? And then the Kremlin hit back. Maybe you can just tell us about that and whether this is sort of, I guess, a manifestation of what we're talking about, which is this is not a strong empire anymore, which is going to keep us safe.
Exactly. This is an exact manifestation of a country that has no strategic credibility. Vladimir Putin's laughing up his sleeve. Likewise, Trump announced 145% tariffs on China just a couple of weeks ago. And China said, well, here's our counter tariff on you. And 5 days later, Trump says, okay, you be nice, I'll be nice, and retreats, takes it back again, temporarily at least. The Chinese haven't budged. The Chinese have called his bluff, and he's backed down. So wherever you look, nobody is taking the US as seriously as it used to. As I said, Trump's not uniquely responsible for this. Barack Obama started this. I should also add that the Americans haven't always used their great power very wisely. Some of the most atrocious, unjustifiable and unjustified wars have been American projects. Vietnam, Iraq, terrible misjudgments with terrible consequences. Yeah. The difference was then that, Samantha, there were predators in the world. There was Russia. There is increasingly China. There is also America. America's always been a predator, but it's been our predator, and it's because we're its ally.
Yes.
And that has helped protect our interests. What's happened now is that there are these predators stalking the globe, and we don't seem to be able to trust any of them.
But beyond that, we're looking at possibly the end of the American empire. So that's
no great empire dies without death throes, and that's what you would see.
It sort of leaves your jaw dropping. So thank you so much, Peter.
Always a pleasure, Samantha.